Hi, everyone. I'm glad you're here because today's episode is a doozy. Today, I have 3 stories that nearly shattered everyone involved as they tried to rationalize what happened to them. Just wait until you hear what you're about to hear. So, if you're enjoying the channel, don't be invisible. Let us know you're out there and smash that subscribe button so we can always be together. Thanks. Now, let's get into the stories. Joining the Coast Guard had been one of my dreams ever since I was a teenager. So as soon as high school was over, I enlisted. I was stationed on the North Oregon coast in the Tillamook Bay area. When I think about it, I was so young and energetic back then. I couldn't think of anything I'd rather be doing as a young person, but of course, I enjoyed my downtime too. When we got a weekend off, I liked to explore the area. I wasn't from Oregon, so everything there was new to me. One weekend, a group of us decided to check out a beach that some had never been to. There were 4 of us that night, 2 guys and 2 girls. We weren't exactly couples, we were just hanging out. We got to the beach and made a small bonfire, which I'm not even sure if we were allowed to do, and we planned to camp or really just stay out all night, out near some dunes. It was chilly that night, but the fire felt great. It was kind of an out-of-the-way spot, so we anticipated that we wouldn't see many people, and hopefully, no one at all. That night turned out to be quite dark, too. There were a few houses a little ways off, but they had their lights out, and all you could see were 2 street lamps in the distance. We'd been sitting out there for hours when the other couple went to get more blankets from the car. It was parked just on the other side of a sand dune, so a bit out of sight. It was probably about 3 a.m. at the time. I was lying next to the fire on a sleeping bag I had brought when I heard this high-pitched yelping noise that seemed to be getting progressively louder. It turned into this screech that really sounded alarming. We thought it must be an animal, but then it started sounding more human-like. Then the 2 of us at the fire still jumped up, thinking maybe it was our friends back at the car. We sprinted towards them and intercepted them at the sand dune just as they were heading back to us. They had heard the screeching noises too and thought maybe one of us had been hurt. We could still hear the noises coming from the direction of some nearby trees, and we debated how smart it would be to check it out. We tried to pinpoint where the screaming was coming from, but it was hard to tell the exact direction. It seemed to be coming from every direction, and the sound of the ocean wasn't helping much either. Not to mention the darkness. We made our way back to the campsite once the screeching had stopped, but we didn't use our lights because we didn't want to identify our position. We only got a few yards along when we heard a deep cough. We all stopped. It was impossible to see anything, but we could hear shuffling noises too. We stayed hidden behind some of the brush until we heard what sounded like dragging, as if something heavy was being pulled across the surface of the sand. At this point, my imagination was going wild at what might be happening out in the darkness in front of me. And then we heard a noise again, and at that point, I was getting a strong urge to run. We were about to turn around when all of a sudden, this huge beast appeared between 2 of the trees. It sure wasn't anything normal. It stood upright and was between 7 and 8 feet tall. At that point, I went ahead and I turned on my tactical flashlight. I needed to have some idea of what we were dealing with. The thing was covered with reddish-brown hair, and it looked to be soaking wet. And it looked like a giant, a Neanderthal or something. We stopped and just stared at it. It had a heavy brow ridge and pronounced lips. It had beady black eyes and was staring toward us, even though my light must have been blinding it. It had hold of a large animal, too, which I can only think was probably the dragging sound that we heard. From what I could tell, it appeared to be a dead sea lion. Presumably, this huge creature had been out in the ocean, hunting. When I shined my light on it, it started bellowing, and at that point we all simultaneously turned around and hightailed it out of there as fast as we could. We all got in the car and drove up the road toward where the few houses and streetlights were, and we just sat there, under the light. We figured that if we were near streetlights, we could see that thing coming if it was inclined to follow us. We were scared crapless, and we just kept throwing out theories as to what in the hell it could have been. Honestly, the closest we could agree on was that it resembled what we imagined a Bigfoot to look like. But all of us had the same thinking. How could that be? Because even though Bigfoot hadn't been proven, we've only ever heard of it in the depths of forests. It seemed crazy to think that we might have spotted one that had been hunting in the ocean. We stayed in the car until sunrise. It was already like 4 a.m. anyway, so it was only another hour or so. The entire time we kept a lookout for any sign of movement, any sign that it was nearby. And then at the crack of daylight, we headed back to the beach to make sure the fire was out, gather any last items, and continued out of there. I did feel obligated to report it all to my chief petty officer. He asked quite a few questions, and I gave him all the details I could remember. His reaction was fairly low-key, and it was hard for me to tell what he really thought. But I figured that I'd done my duty, and they could now make their own determination as to if an investigation was necessary. I did keep a close eye on the news for any reports for a while afterward, but nothing ever came up. So, I go to college over in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and last semester I had the most terrifying experience of my life, just outside of one of the frat houses off campus. This is what I saw. You can decide for yourself if you want to believe it or not. It was January, the start of the spring semester, and some friends of mine were throwing this huge party to welcome everyone back. I was having a great time, honestly, for the majority of the night. Something that I noticed early on when I first arrived was that there was garbage scattered everywhere in the front yard. All the trash bags and cans had been toppled over and torn into. Obviously, I assumed that this was because of some animal, but it was actually insane how much trash was scattered about. I mention this because not only was the yard of that frat house trashed, but so were the yards of nearly every other adjacent house on the block. It seemed like whatever was messing with the garbage was hungry. Coming from a rural area myself, we had a lot of times where we had an unwelcome stay from a family of raccoons, or even the occasional bear. But it was never as bad as the way that block looked, so much so that everybody I was with that day commented on it. And then, that was the last I thought of it, until later. A few hours later, around midnight, I went out on the porch for a smoke with my friends. And that's when I noticed that the porch reeked like urine and something else that I couldn't put my finger on. I assumed someone partied too hard and peed on the porch as a joke or something. I don't know. I couldn't think of any other reason other than that. So we were out there for a little while when all of a sudden, we hear a yell coming from the opposite side of the yard, from the front side of the house. It takes me a second to register what the hell is going on, but my friends run back inside and try to see what the fuss is about. So there I am, alone on the porch with no idea about the impending weird stuff that I'm about to witness. I hear a distant conversation, yelling, but I'm not paying too much attention to it. I'm just sort of looking out into the yard, smoking. Then I see it run by. Coming from the front of the house is a creature that is big, massive even, and sprinting fast as hell. In fact, it was so quick that at first I didn't even have the slightest idea what it looked like, only that it was speeding right through the yard, and that it was big. And then it stops. It stops right near the edge of the yard where the forest starts. It sits there for a moment, and even though it's dark, I managed to finally get a decent look at it. It was some kind of a wolf, dog, a combination of both. Just the grossest thing you could imagine, sitting there on all fours and frothing at the mouth. I choked. It scared the crap out of me, and I just choked on my cigarette with the loudest, most obnoxious cough you've ever heard. Well, of course, that was a huge mistake. With that, the creature snapped its head towards me, and now we are making eye contact. I thought I was going to die, honestly. My nerves were shot. I just kept hoping that maybe somebody would come back outside and check on me or something. I couldn't move. I wanted to yell, but I knew that if I did, it would probably set the thing off somehow. So I kept quiet. And as I'm looking at it, the freakiest thing happens. This wolf, it gets up and it stands on its hind legs, still staring at me. Now I really think I'm losing my mind because as big as I thought it was before, now the thing is standing at least 7 feet in the air, taller than me, taller than any person I've ever been next to. It was so confusing to look at, really. But I wasn't so messed up that I didn't know what I was seeing. I could tell this was not normal. It had these crazy eyes, like glowing human eyes on a dog-like head. I told you already about how tall the thing was, but it wasn't just tall, it was also jacked. Its odd human torso was insanely muscular, which explains how it moved around so quickly, I suppose. I just didn't fully comprehend its anatomy. Even the human parts had fur, and even the animal parts looked vaguely human-shaped. We just sat there for a moment looking at each other. I stood as still as I possibly could, and as boring as that might sound, I think it worked. Eventually, I won the staring match, and that monster thing just sort of became bored, I think. Lost interest in me. It turned around and it ran straight into the woods without so much as a second glance. I'll never forget that thing. Its eyes, the novelty of it all. I still go to school there in Michigan, so who knows? Maybe I'll run into that thing again. If I do, I'll certainly give you an update and let you know about it. One good thing, though, I think we figured out the mystery behind all of that torn-up garbage, and it definitely wasn't a family of raccoons. When I lived in Ohio, I had a job working for the sheriff's department. I remember one of my first duties was patrolling a wooded area. From my understanding, it was one of those tasks that nobody wanted, so being young and new, I was given the job. I didn't realize that I was given the grub work until much later in my employment, but hey, it was an interesting experience. As I understood it, the area was known to attract people who were often up to no good, or doing mischievous business. I had come to think of it as a lover's lane type of an area, but as it turned out, it attracted a much different type of mischief. The night in question was one of those nights, very warm, but kind of humid. This wasn't unusual for Ohio, but the days had been so hot that the rain didn't even help. It just made everything sticky. So what felt like 8 hours of patrol was actually only 2. Time seemed to stand still on this particular night. Maybe it was because I was feeling a little overworked. The week had been especially long. And this specific night happened to be Friday night for me. And I just really wanted to get home. Sometimes if the nights were calm, I would park a while and just relax. Basically, stop patrolling. This was one of those nights. It was pretty calm, no disruptions other than the uncomfortable feeling of the heat and the wet air. So I paused patrolling and I parked. I know it doesn't sound like the most appropriate thing to do when you're on duty, park and just relax, but I kind of just let myself take the time as a little break. But that's when it happened. I was soon contacted on the radio about multiple reports of an unusual green light just up the road from where I was. I thought, of course, this would happen. I didn't think anything would come of it, but I hopped into my vehicle and I started circling again, patrolling. I figured the green light might best be explained by kids who came to the woods looking for trouble. I circled and I circled, but I didn't see anything like a green light. And then after about an hour or so, I decided to hop out of the vehicle again. I couldn't stand sitting in there despite the humidity outside. Also, now I was bored and I started just flashing my flashlight around into the trees, thinking maybe I could spot the kids. Maybe they had fireworks. I know this story makes me sound irresponsible or like I wasn't working hard, but I didn't know what else to do to keep myself from falling asleep. I was young, not that that makes a difference. Anyway, I'm shining my flashlight around, I'm looking at some of the trees, and this all gets boring pretty quickly. So I turned off my flashlight and sat on the hood of my vehicle. I even started to text a few friends when I started to hear something approaching me. I could hear the sound of leaves crunching underfoot and some cracking as if branches were being broken. I looked up, but I didn't see anything, so I put my phone down and started looking around. It was dark and I was surrounded nearly completely by trees. This excluded the area of the dirt path and the strange little parking area that was basically just a piece of dirt, but I still couldn't see anything. If it had been a person, I think I would have seen them by now. The trees were pretty tall, but the trunks were rather thin, so the dense area of leaves started probably about 12 feet up from the ground. So a person would be noticeable, right? Also, I didn't hear any talking or giggling, and that made it even more bizarre. If it had been kids, they surely would be making noise, usually laughing. But all I heard was this strange movement in the distance. I tried picturing pleasant things because I started to get a little freaked out. I told myself it was just a dog in the woods. That didn't seem too scary. I kept looking toward the trees, and then I noticed that one of the trees appeared to move in a strange way, like it was swaying at the trunk. You know, when you're out in the dark and certain things look much darker than everything else, well, that's what these trees looked like. They looked darker than everything else, like a shadow of themselves, if that makes sense. And then I realized that the tree that moved, it no longer looked like a tree. It now looked like a very tall person, as in about 9 feet tall. It looked like it had shoulders and arms and a neck and all the things that a human would. I told myself I was hallucinating. The dark can do that to people. It's tricky. But then the shadow moved again, and this time I saw a distinct head. But I didn't see a face, just the shadow of where its head would be. How did I know it was its head, though? Well, I could see eyes. Its eyes were glowing this strange orange color. I was now terrified. What was I to do? What was this thing? I didn't have an answer for these questions. And before I could think, I found myself jumping into the patrol car and speeding off towards town. I started thinking about the reports of the green light and how this strange thing was in the woods. Did both of these incidents stem from each other? Like, did this shadow with orange eyes come from the green light? That wouldn't make much sense, would it? Or maybe it would. I'm not sure what I saw. I'm not sure if it was a creature from outer space or if it was one of those ape monsters that people always talk about. All I know is it scared a lot of life out of me.